Political at the University of Verona. Professor Cavarero has held many visiting professorships positions in various US universities, such as Harvard, Berkeley, and New York University. She was among the founders of the Diotima philosophical community in Verona, whose members, female members, took up the challenge of being women and thinking philosophically. As a woman and as a philosopher, Cavarero has sought to dismantle the master's house using the master's tool. Her work has therefore attempted to rewrite ancient philosophy through feminist engagements with Plato, Homer, and Parmenides. Her work has also been devoted to redirect ontology, politics, and ethics away from sacred truth, norms, and universals, and towards unique subjectivities, or as she calls them, narratable selves, whose voice differs from all other voices and whose story is distinctive and unrepeatable, as she claims in her remarkable book, Relating Narratives, Storytelling, and Selfhood. As a feminist political theorist and philosopher, Professor Cavarero has given primacy to the voice over speech, to the body over the mind, to the relational over the rational. Her fascinating book, For More Than One Voice, Toward a Philosophy of Vocal Expression, testifies to this lifelong endeavor. In more recent years, her attention has turned towards the political sphere. In her book, Horrorism, Naming Contemporary Violence, she has offered us a provocative revision of violence as horrorism, as a mutilating and, if I may add, cowardly force that targets the helpless. In Inclinations, a critique of rectitude, Professor Cavarero asks readers to rethink subjectivity as inclined towards others, rather than as an erect being. This singular bodily posture as leaning forward and being responsive represents a call for a democracy that is embodied, vulnerable, but also dynamic, resurgent, and bent towards others, as she makes clear in her latest book, Surging Democracy, Notes on Hannah Arendt's Political Thought. Very recently, she has inaugurated another research thread that investigates the complicity of women with nature, exposing the dark and tremendous sides of pregnancy. The title of her lecture today is therefore Euripides Bacchae and the Defeat of the Polis. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm very happy to be at the University of Trento and to be part of this lecture program. I'm trying to do my best, and my talk is on Euripides Bacchae, and I'm going to give sort of political interpretation, maybe too much pushed to the extreme. This is my way of reading ancient texts. So as you know, the Bacchae is a tragedy by Euripides written about around 410 before Christ. The drama takes place in Thebes, where the god Dionysus arrives in human form, disguised as a stranger. The first part of the tragedy focuses on the narration of an horrendous crime, the killing of Semele, a Theban princess and the mother of Dionysus. Zeus is the one, Zeus, not Zeus, Zeus is Greek. Zeus is the one who kills her. After seducing and impregnating Semele, he incinerates her with a lightning bolt so that the dying mother expels the fetus from her womb. The premature son is promptly sewn into Zeus' tide and carried to term. Dionysus is therefore referred to as twice born, first from a mother womb and second from a father's thigh. The wonder Zeus is no stranger to such transgender pregnancy. According to mythical traditions, the goddess Athena was born fully grown and fully armed, emerging from Zeus' head, causing him a great headache. It is unknown whether Dionysus' birth from the side was equally painful, but from Euripides' tragedy we know that Semele, while Zeus incinerated her, went through the normal labor pains. Significantly enough, in Euripides' play, neither Dionysus nor the chorus of the Maenads accompanying him considered this act of incineration as reprehensible. On the contrary, Dionysus claimed the divine status that he gets, so to speak, directly through his bodily connection with his father, in addition to accusing the Thebans of denying him the worship he deserves as Zeus' son. He blamed them for not erecting altars at his mother's tomb. His tone is very threatening. It is a furious and vengeful Dionysus that appears at the beginning of the Bacchae, setting the plot in motion. There is in this plot a distressing family affair. In Thebes, Cadmus, the father of Semele, still lives. Although Pentheus, the son of another daughter of Cadmus, Agave, now reigns in the city. Therefore, Agave is both the sister of Semele and the aunt of Dionysus, who in turn is the cousin of Pentheus. Close family ties are a typical ingredient of Greek theater. However, in this case, a prominent role is given to Semele's sisters, a sororal group of mothers who, along with the other women of Thebes possessed by Dionysus, transform into Bacchantes and disrupt the order and customs of the polis. Driven away by the whip of Dionysus, the Theban women leave their homes in the grip of madness, mania, and free to mount Cithaeron to worship the god. It is a particular type of initiatory madness, characterized by an experience of ecstatic frenzy that, by taking one out of oneself, dissolves the form of the individual into the perpetual regenerative flow of life. Flow of life is my attempt to translate the Greek word zoe, a word which denotes the entire multiple and proliferating universe of living beings. Differently told, zoe specifically refers to the generative and nurturing power that the maternal body and mater nature share. As Nietzsche suggests, the primordial connection of the living related to the archaic myth of Zoe, as in Dionysus is God. Tellingly, in Euripides' play, the Bacchan's experience of such a mysterious original unity of all living being entails the collapse of the distinction between human and the animal. Indeed, the madness that seizes the women of Thebes in the tragedy is decidedly marked by the dynamic of excess that is the frenzy of an ecstatic transformation that by definition exceeds limits. You know, it is the excess of the ecstatic. Through the drama, this act of surpassing the maternal role gradually transforms into the unprecedented embodiment of a maternity that knows no bounds, a maternity that, by pushing its power to excess, reveals itself as uncanny and wild. In the development of the plot, this occurs gradually and in a crescendo of phases that lead to the final catastrophe. As Bonnie Honig, in her book A Feminist Theory of Refusal, by rereading Euripides Bacchae, points out, with the women that flee to the Mount Citeron, we are in the presence of the first of these stages, a stage of refusal or rejection of the domestic role. The women go to an elsewhere than the civilized world of the polis, in the midst of the forest and wild animals. Here they dance, inebriated with joy, feeding on wine, milk, and honey that gush spontaneously from the earth. We know that in 50th century Athens there were active guilds of ecstatic dance, such as that of the Corybants, follower of the Greek mother Cybele. And we learn from Maria Gimbutas, who is a famous archaeologist, that statuettes representing a woman's body with big breast and a swollen belly testifies of the spread of the cult of the Great Mother in Neolithic Europe. Ecstatic dances were part of the cult. Euripides' twirling bacchantes, some of them mothers fresh from childbirth, fit the picture perfectly well. The feast on the Citeron, inclusive of singing, friends in dancing, and fast running, excites the followers of Dionysus, driving them to a deep communion with nature and, above all, with animals. In fact, to the prodigy of a nature that spontaneously bestows inebriating beverage is added a scenario that arouses immediate wonder, while serpents entwining in the women's locks delicately lick their cheeks, those among them who, fresh from childbirth, have swollen breasts, forgetful of the newborn children left at home, suckle fawns and wolf cubs. This Euripides. Now we are therefore in the presence of a feminine behavior that is no longer merely a rejection of the domestic role within the polis order, but an experience of a new and different way of life, whose generative, loving, and transformative character, according to Bonnie Honig, is accompanied by a joyful ecstasy of closeness with an exuberant and spontaneously nurturing nature, as well as with an animal species that is now undistinguishable from the human one. The Bacchant does not distinguish between the infant song and the baby animal. Intraspecific relationships are transcended. Just as nature spontaneously makes wine, milk, and honey gush from the earth to nourish human and not human living being, so too spontaneously does the Bacchant suckle them. Hers is a nurturing exuberance inherent in the figure of a motherhood that knows no limits, according to Walter Otto, a kind of primeval motherhood in the indistinction of the infant, human or feral, that is, I dare say, a kind of hyper maternity, imagined as a frenzy of nutrition, body feeding body, life feeding life, living feeding living. Symptomatically, erotic frenzy commonly ascribed to the Dionysian orgy is totally absent in the Euripidean Bacchants. What excites the women most in this ecstatic phase, beside dancing and singing, is the maternal function of breastfeeding, a function that the women of Thebes already performed in the domestic sphere, but which now, exceeding the very boundaries and roles of that spheres, and therefore of the polis order, becomes unexpectedly wild and in accordance with the nutritive generosity of a primordial nature, bestow the bliss of the satiated body on the animal cub. In fact, up to the stage of the Dionysian intoxication, up to this point of the plot, the behavior of the Bacchants refers back to a life, a zoe, exalted above all in terms of a nutritive power that by feeding the living generate that pleasure of nourishment which, for the infant, first greedy and then full, is the bliss of the satiated body. Let me state it. Let me state my thesis in few words. Nourishment is here pleasure. If there is an erotics here, it is an erotic of feeding. In accordance with the nature that spontaneously offers sweet and inebriating food, the Bacchant turns her very body into a source of food and pleasure for the living, regardless of species. Clearly, fawns and wolf cubs, that is, wild species, hint here at a gratuitous and gratifying nutrition that counteracts every declination of the domestic, beginning with the human labor to obtain food or the domestication of animals for food. We are beyond the dimension of techne and the politica. We are into the wild. Let me remind you that in the history of Western imaginary, as you know, there are numerous legends of men being sacked by she-wolves or bears when they were infant. For instance, Romulus and Remus sacked by a she-wolf are part of the foundational myth of Rome. The idea of a nurturing hypermaternity that exceeds species limits is part of a well-known repertoire that, in the case of Rome, functions as a foundational myth of politics and civilization. Here, however, Euripides provides a very special version of it, a version that accentuates the complicity of this nurturing hyperbole of the maternal body with the generative and regenerative force of a life, a zoe, that tend to embrace all living beings in an undifferentiated and for each rewarding, pleasurable way. Indeed, there is a pleasure in this erotics of breastfeeding characterized by a motherhood pushed to the excess. Actually, if you allow me to play with etymology, excess is an access. An access to the inaccessible, in this case, to the inebriating flow of Zoe, We are evidently in the presence of a Dionysian variant of the myth of the Golden Age, narrated by Hesiod. As in Hesiod's tale, we find the outstanding phenomenon of a fertile land that spontaneously yields rich and abundant fruits, thus allowing the golden human race a life of infinite pleasure, without pain, without toil, and without troubles. In other words, we are witnessing a sort of vegetarian paradise. This is Vernon, projected into an originary pre-political time that does not involve agriculture and therefore the laboriousness of work. However, unlike in Hesiod's account, at the center of this Euripidean scene, we find the inebriation of mothers who are beyond themselves, breastfeeding wild offspring. Through a nurturing maternal body, the human transcends its species and becomes inhuman, euphorically animal. Described as wild, excessive, irrepressible, unmasterable, but nevertheless natural, the maternal power carries something of uncanny with it. The entire plot of Euripides' tragedy is supported by the eruption of an outside, a wildness that stands in contrast to the civil order of the polis. Symptomatically, in relation to this eruption of the Dionysian into the ordinary world, some interpreters speak of a manifestation of truth. According to scholars like Caroli Chereni and Walter Otto, the disruptive vitality of Dionysus, the twice born, has to do with the tumult of the maternal womb. I'm quoting Chereni and Otto. The tumult that rages wherever generation and birth occur. Since birth is a primordial phenomenon of the sphere of being, that is, of the sphere of Zoe. Yet, in my opinion, rather than focusing on the generative power of the maternal womb, cruelly mortified in the case of Simene, Euripides' tragedy, at least until now, seemed to engage with the theme of a maternal body exalted in its nurturing power, that is, a savage and inebriating motherhood, whose generosity extends beyond the human form of the living. Crucially, in the first phase of the drama, the primordial force of Zoe erupts in the form of generous, gratuitous, intoxicating interspecies nourishment, which is alien to any kind of violence, particularly the bloodthirsty violence of killing a living body to consume its flesh. Animal cubs, like infants, and perhaps the mythical inhabitants of the Golden Age, do not eat meat. Wine, milk, and honey are symbols of a nourishing pleasure that avoids the killing of the living for sustenance. Importantly, however, Dionysus, the god of wine and intoxicating beverages, is also the god of meat consumption. His cult involves the bloody sacrifice of animals, plausibly, in ancient times, of human animals, later replaced by gods. Hovering over the typical Dionysian indistinction between the human and the animal is here the specter of cannibalistic feasting. While the first part of the drama tells us of how the Bacchanals participate in the nourishing feast of life, in the second part of the drama, It is no longer the lush, natural, and free food of the Golden Age that serve as the backdrop of the myth of Dionysus, but rather the experience of hunting, in which humans and animals share the roles of hunter and prey. Let me insist on the sudden twist of the tragedy plot. After the phase in which mothers breastfeed fawns and wolf cubs, a further phase is introduced in which the Bacchanals are turned into wild huntresses. This phase will culminate in their hunt for the quintessential carnivorous animal, the lion, the supreme predator that does not disdain human flesh. Horrendously enough, however, it will not actually be a lion, but a man, King Pentheus, mistaken by his mother Agave for a lion. The new phase is shocking indeed, and it reaches the heights of horror. The triggering cause is the Bacchae discovery of being spied upon by men hidden among the bushes, who, according to Agave, are hunting them, urged by Agave herself, like swift hounds. The women then launch themselves in pursuit of the men, who barely escape being torn apart by Frank. Meanwhile, the women, having thrown themselves upon the hearth, grazing on the green grass, capture, kill, and tear apart with bare hands the unfortunate animals whose raw flesh they devour. We are clearly in a state that precedes the famous transition from raw to cooked. Cows and bulls, under the hands of the Bacchae, are dismembered and reduced to bloody shreds. Historically, the scene evokes the procedure of dismemberment, the sparagmos in Greek, in the Dionysian ritual, a ritual in which the initiates tore apart with their bare hands the sacred animal that embodied the god, either the goat or in Crete the bull, and consume its raw flesh, and this is the Greek homophagy. The background is here a society of wild hunters who, on certain occasions, identify themselves with predatory animals. In the mythical tradition, it is indeed Dionysus himself who is torn to pieces by the Titans, although he is later reassembled so that he can be reborn once again. Dionysus, who often assumes an animal form and urges the Bacchanals not to distinguish between human and animal, is also the god who identifies with the sacrificial animal. In Euripides' tragedy, this Dionysian hybridization of humanity and animality reaches its climax when the Bacchanals, in their hunting frenzy, kill and tear apart King Pentheus with their bare hands, mistaking him for a lion. In fact, at one point of the drama, on the advice of a cunning Dionysus who devises the entire scheme and has no qualms about confusing sexual difference, Pentheus disguises himself as a Maenad in women clothing. He climbs up a tree in the forest and tries to spy on the Bacchanals and uncover their supposed sexual orgy. It is in this circumstance that his mother Agave sees Pentheus and, believing him to be a lion, kills him and tears him apart. We have reached the pinnacle of horror, a peak of dread where the blurring of boundaries between human and animal transforms into the mother's inability to recognize her son in the prey she's killing, or rather euphorically tearing apart. Yet the unfortunate Pentheus had indeed cried out to her, "Mother, I'm your son," but of course in vain. The desperate play to distinguish between song and beast, between human and animal, find no place in the violent Dionysian frenzy to which the story has led. And the story is not yet concluded. With Pentheus' head impaled on a stick, a proud and wild Agave leads the procession of women back to the city to display the trophy of their bare-handed hunt. Cadmus, by bringing her back to her senses, convinces Agave that the severed head is actually that of her son. Devastated by grief and in mourning, Agave is banished from Thebes, while Dionysus appears on the scene as a classicus deus ex machina, transforming Cadmus and his wife into serpents. Thebes and the ruling family are defeated. Dionysus has triumphed on the polis, and his cult has been celebrated in practice. At least this is how the play of Euripides narrates it, a text that many interpreters consider an essential document for the study of the Dionysian rites in ancient Greek. The same rites that, according to Aristotle, are the origin of tragic theater as a form of expression. There is evidently in Euripides' drama a trace of misogyny, prominently represented by Zeus incinerating Semele to incorporate the fruit of her womb and give birth to it. However, there is also the recovery and exaltation of the archaic imaginary that calls on a primordial complicity between the maternal body and the Dionysian myth of Zoe. The indistinction, fusion, assimilation between the human and the animal that characterizes the experience of this body is part of the picture and emphasizes the figure of a limitless maternity, that is, an hyper-maternity, driving into the darkness of visceral recesses that tie it to the exuberant continuity of life. A zoontology of the maternal, I dare say. I'm aware, of course, that by speaking of the zoontology of the maternal, I touch again on possible misogynistic implications. As a feminist, I know too well that whenever the text reveals the tendency of the patriarchal symbolical order to degrade women into animals, irrational creatures with whom the female gender would have a certain natural affinity, a suspicion of misogyny is justified. Yet, the image of Agave tearing her son apart with her bare hands and proudly raising his head on a stick seems to surpass the limits of any misogynistic representation of the maternal. Moreover, it notably surpasses the limits of that limitless maternity, this is the definition of Vatterotto, embodied by the Euripidean Bacchans themselves. By pushing hypermaternity beyond its constitutive hyperbole, the narrative here touches something unheard of, something that goes far beyond the usual standards of misogyny. With the dismemberment of Pentheus, we witness the delirium of a hypermaternity that, as excessive as it already is, so to speak, exceeds its own excess. After all, on this issue, Euripides' narrative displays a noticeable consistency. We know from the very beginning that the Bacchantes are primarily nurturers of Dionysus, the god of Zoe, of the flow of life. And we have seen that the phase of wild hunting is preceded by a phase that intensifies Zoe in its nutritive dimension, dramatically interspecific, symbolized by women breastfeeding wild animals. Essentially, therefore, the narrative of the entire story revolves around a seemingly banal equation between living and eating. To live, to be a body for the living being, is to consume the other living being, whether vegetable or animal, incorporating their fluids or bodies. What prevails is the living fabric of a zoet that manifests itself in the form of a shared nutrition. Vegetarian or carnivorous, joyous or bloody, festive or violent, it is the primal necessity of nourishment that unites all living beings to frame the saints of Dionysian frenzies embodied by the Bacchantes in the tragedy. The abrupt transition from the first to the second phase of the story is the shift from two different representations of the food chain, made evident precisely by the fact that in the second representation, humans also serve as food. Clearly, the act of Agave killing and tearing apart her son and then proudly displaying his severed head as a trophy carries an expressive force that touches upon the unprecedented horror to which the story has arrived. Let me remind you that Greek mythology doesn't refrain at all from recounting atrocious infanticide, which on the contrary abound with it. Nor the mythical tradition lacks stories of men being killed, dismembered, boiled, and eaten in various circumstances. Differently told, the horror of a carnivorous diet passed to a cannibalism is a current topic in ancient mythology. Yet Euripides' play hints at a distinctive horror that seems to surpass the horror of this current topic. My thesis, in conclusion, is that such a distinctive and uncanny horror depends on his original and unparalleled focus on the issue of maternity. Namely, Euripides seems to outline here a zoontology of maternity, or if you want, a zoontology of the human, that substantiates in two extreme versions, both radically naturalistic and anti-anthropocentric. The first version, by exalting an originary communion between the human and nature, describe a universe alternative and opposed to the attitude of man as the most fearsome of creatures, dominating and exploiting nature. I have in mind, of course, the famous choral ode of Sophocles' Antigone, where man is defined deinoteron, literally the most uncanny of all living beings, because of his arrogance in exploiting nature and the world of the living. On the opposite, in Euripides' vegetarian paradise, humans embodied by women would feed animal offspring are perfectly embedded in a harmonious biosphere. The second version suggests instead that perhaps within the natural competition between carnivorous animals, in their mutual consumption lies an even more uncanny and unsettling revelation. In the tragedy, it is a wild mother who embodies this extreme uncanniness. This is part of Euripides' strategy to depict a zoology of the maternal that, remarkably, do not focus primarily on childbirth and generation, but exclusively on the necessity and pleasure, the fury and ecstasy of nourishment. So that we can conclude that the figure of the Bacchans evokes the archaic culture of the Great Mother only to a certain extent. Extraordinarily, the generating power of the female body, symbolized in the ritual female statuettes by swollen belly, is in fact neglected here in favor of a nurturing hypermaternity that exalts the primordial power of Zoe in terms of the sustenance of the living. Life is not only the perpetual generation of living organisms, as Euripides' wild mothers warn us, but also the mutual nourishment of these organisms as long as they are alive. The play not only recounts the defeat of the polis at the hands of women possessed by Dionysus, but also draws on the archaic truths of the ontology of the human that displays, without the filter of civilization or device of anthropocentrism, the corporeal dimension of our being living forms among other living forms. The excess of Euripides' Bacchae forces the zoon politikon to face the reality of this being first and foremost zoon. Thank you.
Respondents who I would like to invite here. Yeah, please.
Should I go first? Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michele, Nicoletti, and Tiziana Faitini for this invitation. And thank you to the friends of the University of Trento. I was thinking, Adriana, while I was listening to your paper and also while I read your paper before, and also it was a strange experience to read it in English for me now, because I know your text in Italian, but reading it in English and thinking also about the use of this very material words, like, for example, I didn't know that to suckle was a synonym of breastfeeding.
Yeah.
I confess that I didn't know. I learned it by reading your paper. So the use of all these words that refer to a materiality of the body was made me think of the fact that these are very unusual words for philosophy. So philosophy is not used to these material words. And it is, in fact, not by chance that you, in all your work, in all your feminist philosophical work, have tried to deconstruct the metaphysical tradition by going to a sort of material dimension of the body, of the feminine body, but also the material, for example, of the dismembered body in horrorism. You don't, I think that your philosophical style has this, or as I said, as I had written here, your philosophical voice has a specific timbre, in my opinion. And this timbre is a timbre that always looks for what is there, what is given in its materiality. And I think it's a very original way of doing philosophy. And it's a way that by necessity recurs to non-philosophical texts, like tragedy, like poetry, like literature, as you do in your latest book, which is Donne che allattano cuccioli di lupo. One would have to think of the English translation of that title at some point.
Breastfeed.
Or suckle. Maybe suckle is more colloquial, I guess, than breastfeeding. So I was thinking about this sort of extraneity while reading a philosophical text that at the same time recurs to these very material words and refers to these very material images. So I would like you, if you can, say something about what I would call, but I know that it's a word that you don't like, your methodology in working in this way, in working with texts that are not philosophical texts and looking for, to some extent, looking for material words. If you could say something on this.
Yeah. Yes, there is something I did beginning from In Spite of Preto, that is a very old book of many years ago. And I found in writing In Spite of Preto, I found the necessity of going beyond the limits of philosophical language. And given that I am a scholar on Plato, it is very interesting to engage with Plato because Plato is both the father of the philosophical language, so ideas and so on, the forms, but also his writings has the not the memory, but come si dice?
Echo,
Not the echo. He's engaged with narrative. I mean, he is an inventor and a counter of myths, and this is narrative. So in Plato, the two register, the narrative register and the philosophical register, linguistic register, are mixed up. But if you go on in rereading the history of philosophy, the language, there are exceptions. For example, Nietzsche. Everybody knows that Nietzsche is an exception. But the language is so typically far from the materiality of life. And so for me, it has been very important, necessary, not only important, necessary, in order to find something coherent with the fact that we are embodied creature having a body, we have different bodies. I am a feminist of the sexual difference. I mean, Olivia as well, we always dealt with bodies, with materiality, the materiality of giving birth. And in order to resist the abstraction of philosophy, for me it has been necessary and important to reread the narrative tradition and to go through the narrative tradition or the literary tradition to grasp, si dice grasp in inglese? To grasp, to seize, to seize some materialistic terminology. And this is also why I was interested in the back of Euripides. Because everybody knows that Euripides Bacchae is a very strange play in which we deal with the wild, with the feminine wild, and the wild is the anti-political, and according to Bonnie Honig, is the refusal and the resistance to the political. This is clear. But I was struck by the fact that the wild feminine, what also Walter Otto and Kereni say when they reread the book, the very heart of the feminine world here is represented not as the process of giving birth, of motherhood as generation, which is what is very interesting but for Plato, as you know. The mimesis of the maternal power to generate ideas. But here the focus is, in my opinion, this is my interpretation, totally on nourishment, totally on life as something dealing with nourishment, because we are alive, we were born, okay, this is true. But after we were born, we are alive because we eat. And to make an hyperbole of these ties between the feminine body, the breastfeeding, a life as sustenance, and the blurring of the limit between animal and human, it seems to me that it was something beyond just the refusal of the political. It's sort of alternative, profoundly and excessively materialistic word. But Euripides is a genius in his capacity of depicting this word.
A very quick follow-up on this. Again, this materiality, this excess, this materiality expressed in this excess, or in this, one would say, in this tale of nourishment that is the Bacchae, is thinking also of the rest of your recent work, your book on Donne che allattano cuccioli di lupo, and also the book that we wrote together. I was also thinking, but this is just an idea, that the insistence on this language, on the materiality of this language, is also, at least from the way I see it from a feminist point of view, is also a way of resisting another type of abstraction, which we criticize in our book, the abstraction that refuses to talk about maternity and talks about gestation You know, this idea of abstracting from the material, from the corporeal materiality of a women's body in order to disembody, in this case, the generation process of maternity. So I think it's interesting, this idea of a maternity unbound, or as you call it, boundless maternity, is also an interesting critical point beyond the reading that you give of Euripides and this nourishment tale. Is a critical, interesting critical point against the abstraction and the disembodiment of the maternal.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Adriana, for this fascinating talk. And as always, I have to say, because I've been lucky enough to have attended more than one seminar or talks of Professor Cavarero, so she's always thought-provoking in her talks. My comments and question also, I think, is connected to what you were saying at the very end about this refusal of politics, and actually something that maybe you just mentioned briefly in the paper, but I would like maybe that we can discuss a little bit more about this. And is the title, first of all, that you choose for this talk, that is Euripides Bacchae and the Defeat of the Polis. I was thinking while we were talking that for sure there is a first very intuitive reason why one may think about this tragedy as the defeat of the polis, also following, for example, Bonnie Honig interpretation of the tragedy. There is this refusal of the polis by the backhands, this act of disobedience. So they refuse their role, they refuse the rules of the polis, and then also the climax of the tragedy at the end is also regicide, basically, in the sense that Pentheus is not only Agave's son, but he's also the king of the polis. So on that first level, of course, the polis is defeated in the sense that the order is defeated. But I would say that if we stay with this idea, is just temporarily defeated, because at the end, basically Agave is exiled, so is pushed out from the city, and the order is somehow restored. So would be just a temporary defeated. And I was thinking that maybe actually what your reading suggests, or may suggest, but that's comes back my question, is maybe a different meaning of this defeat of the polis. That would start by locating this defeat in a different moment of the plot, not the first refusal of the backhands, not the regicide, but the moment in which the backhands return to the city, return proudly to the polis with the triumph of their hands, and they want to be somehow recognized that their experience, the experience they had outside the polis, has been somehow superior to what the polis can provide for, this creation, generation of this nourishing power that you mentioned. And what the polis somehow reacts by a refusal, by rejecting completely this power that has been created. And I think that the exile somehow is symbolic in this sense, because it's somehow the polis that cannot tolerate, cannot incorporate this different experience and have to push outside the polis with the exile. So I was thinking maybe that is the moment where the polis is defeated by itself. So it's not the backhands that actually defeat the polis, but it's the polis' inability or incapacity to retain this nourishing power inside the polis, and has to reject, to push away. So maybe my question can be even summarizing it, just asking, whose tragedy is this one? Is the tragedy of the backhands? Is the tragedy of Pentheus? Or is the tragedy of the polis itself somehow, because of this moment that is the impossibility for a political order to keep this nourishing power as something virtuous, and has to exiled, so to banished from the order.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Natasha. And I mean, I think this is the tragedy of the tragedy. What I mean is that in tragedy, we have a conflict. We have in each tragedy, in the tragedian model, we have two positions, and there is no possibility to conciliate. There is no conciliation on the two positions. It is unresolvable. I mean, the famous tragedy, one of the most famous, which is Antigone. I mentioned it, Antigone. You have the polis, Creon, the political law, and you have Antigone and the ancient archaic law, the natural law, and there is no conciliation, no conciliation. So, for hypothesizing, for observing which plot is that that makes it impossible a conciliation. And Euripides is very clear. At the very beginning, we have Dionysus, a very revengeful Dionysus, who represent the anti-political. He is against the polis because he is rejected by the polis. Because the polis, civis, is described according to many interpretations, is described as the polis representing itself religiously in the Olympian religion, not the Dionysian one, because the Dionysian one is considered alien, foreigner. If something not genuinely Greek, something dealing with the wild, with the elsewhere. And so, in the very beginning, we have this position of Dionysus against the polis. At the end of the story, a Dionysian ritual has been performed, and the polis has been defeated. Temporary, of course, temporary, but we have this representation of a defeat. But I guess what you suggest, and I agree with you, this word, this material word, the word of the multiple forms of the livings, the word in which nature is physis. This is what means the word in Greek. Physis is regeneration, generation and regeneration of the living, and in which humans are just simply part of this process of regeneration. This is incompatible with the polis. The polis cannot live, cannot allow life and the process of life to be inside the polis, because if the process of life in which, this is one of my points on the paper and especially of this book, from which the paper is taken. One of my point is that it is interesting from my point of view to reconstruct a concept of nature which is not taken by the tradition. I mean, how can we think of nature not from an anthropocentric point of view? You know what I mean. And I'm very interested in the concept of nature. And in my opinion, traditionally also the scientific perspective. I'm absolutely in favor of scientific perspective. I'm a fan of science and the scientific progress. I want to be clear. But the traditional and also the scientific perspective on nature is from the privilege of a zone logon econ, who is at the center of nature, at the center of the universe, and who is superior because he has logos. He's superior because he is not only one of the many forms of life, but he is the principal form of life. And is the boss of all the others form of life. This is not me, this is Sophocles, the Antigone, the Inoteron, the most prodigious and fearful creature dominating nature and considering itself as a species superior to nature and boss of nature. So, in my opinion, what is interesting in Euripides is this attention on capacity to describe the human belonging to nature, describes a belonging which is internal to nature. We are a species among many species. Of course, we have logos, but that logos doesn't cancel the fact that we are a form of life between among many forms of life in evolution. So this, as far as, in as much as the polis is the traditional political order and the polis is a construction of the human because the polis is not given in nature. Aristotle is completely right. The polis is not given in nature. The polis is constructed. Constructed beginning from human nature. Man cannot be alone, has to construct a family and so on. Many possible narratives in the history of political thought, but there is always something artificial in polis, in the construction of the polis and the political. So in a way, it is very difficult to find a connection between the history of political imaginary or history of political thought, of the various and different description of what means to be a political or the political, and this other perspective of our being part of a net and not a special knot of this net. And this was interested me.
Grazie, Adriana. Thank you. Adriana, thank you, Professor Nicoletti, that invited us to discuss this paper. I wanted to come back to this hunting gesture, because I think that hunt play a major role in your talk, because finally, I think that hunting and hunt destroy this zoontology of the human, because destroy this original communion between human and nature, as you said, but also because hunting play a major role in this tragedy. But also, I think that hunting war, I don't know, hunting gesture in this play, in this tragedy, destroy some certitude that we have when we face to the hunting in general. We know that the entire tragedy is dominated by the myth of the hunt, because Pentheus ends up being hunted, but also because in the tragedy we see another figure that is very central, that is Actaeon, that is a cousin of Pentheus and ends up being hunted. But also there is another figure that I discover in these days, reading once again this tragedy, that is the Adamante, that is the husband of Ino, will confuse Ino, that participated to the Bacchantes, and will confuse his own son Learchus with a lion in a delirious hunting scene. We know that hunting in Greek mythology, but also in Greek tragedy, appears as a game of inversion, metamorphosis, because to learn to hunt, one must pretend to be an animal, adopt the animal mindset, imitate nature. The hunter imitates, for example, the call of larks, allodole, lo dico perché l'ho appena preso allodole. The hunter imitates the call of larks so that they will come closer. But at the same time, in this ancient story, with this ancient story, we see that in the hunting, one must also learn to deny this feral nature, whether imitated or only temporarily assumed. Human beings, in fact, deny their nature by constructing a series of weapons, tools, appendages, indispensable for successful hunting. But the problem in this tragedy is that the hunting gesture happens without this apathy, in Greek apathy, because in this tragedy, hunting happens with bare hands. And the second problems that I have, the other certitude that this tragedy destroyed in me, is that hunting in Greek tragedy, but also in ancient Greek, is always an authentic heroic initiation, serving as a model for future hoplites. Some myths depict a youth, usually noble and destined to become a prince or king, confronting an animal that has all the traits of a warrior, namely the boar, la caccia al cinghiale. The most famous example is the caccia al cinghiale of Odisseo, that is taken by his grandfather, Autolico. The question is interesting because what kind of initiation does this hunt lead to? Can we consider this hunting gesture, this hunt, as a tragic initiation? And what is this relationship between hunting with bare hands and hunting with apathy, with tricks, with traps, with snares, and so on?
Yeah, I think that you got the point. The point is hunting with bare hands. And it is a question of underlying the indifferentiation between humans and animals. In breastfeeding, we have the indifferentiation between human and animal, because the women breastfeed animals. I'm in a calf crisis. And in the hunting with the bare hands, we have the indifferentiation between human and animal, because the hunters are at the same time praise. And then they are not superior to animals with the technology of hunting, but they are just au pair. They can kill the prey and eat it, and on the contrary, with the same possibility and probability, the lion can kill Agave and eat her. Because here, the presentation of this wild world, which is of course an imaginary world, the presentation of this wild world is the presentation of a sort of equivalence between animals and humans in the necessary process of eating each other or nourishing each other. And as Olivia said, we are in a very deep materialism. Because in the vegetarian paradise, in the first stage of the play, we have this milk and honey and wine gushing from the earth. And milk is of animal origin, so is honey, but wine is not of animal origin. And as everybody knows, you have to work on the vineyard to have wine. Wine is not a spontaneous beverage. But in Homer, in the episode of Polyphemus, you have the Cyclops that they don't have agriculture, they don't know agriculture, but they have spontaneously wine. No. So it is an important topic in Greece, this question of wine. Anyhow, what I wanted to stress as a problem, as a very important issue, is the courage by Euripides to depict some assimilation in differentiation between the human and animal, and this is true for vegetarian diet, and this is true also for meat consumption. So, if I had to give a very short reply to your question, with the hunting or with bare ants, killing not an animal, but Pentheus, we are not only in a pre-political imaginary stadium, we are in the very deep archaic questioning or in casting light on the fact that we are zoe, and we are animal, we eat animal, and we are part of a big and incontrovertible global process of reciprocal nourishment. Of course, the first part, the vegetarian paradise, is without violence, it's dance and happiness. The second part is violence. If you eat the meat, you eat something living. You have to kill a form of the living. And this is toward the question of hunting. But In my opinion, here we are before hunting. We are animal, prey, and hunter, au pair, au pair. There is something horrendous and something fearsome, you know, according to the anthropological and archaeological scholars. This fear, this terror in front of the carnivorous animal when you are a pair. Oh. There's something there.
Funziona? So thank you very much, Adriana, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to Olivia, Natasha, and Giacomo, our friends and colleagues from the University of Verona, for the comments. It was a bit a sacrifice to listen to Adriana in English, because the book is fantastic. The Donne che allattano cuccioli di lupo, in Italiano, in Italian. You can enjoy all the writing of Adriana with all this literary style and charm. But I agree with Olivia that listening to this English version brings all of us to the materiality of the concepts. And I find this idea of going back to the materiality of concepts so important, not only for philosophy, but also for political philosophy. The concept of political philosophy are material, concrete concepts. We cannot talk about friendship or enemy or war or society or oikia or polis without having in mind material dimension of this concept. So thank you so much for this methodological lesson, which is so important for us. My question is related to the centrality of nourishment, which I totally agree. And I have a radical question for you. The concept of nature in Greek, physis, comes from phyo, generation, but it is also nourishment, or is more generation, like in Latin, natura from nascor. But I have the perception sometimes that what is really relevant, even when you read Plato or Aristotle, is more than birth, is being nourished, in educated or grown up in a certain way. So my question would be, and the second one about cannibalism. You totally agree. I think that we cannot understand Thomas Hobbes, for example, if we think the idea of the wolves as a simple metaphor. This is not. This is our prehistory. Do you agree with that? Okay, these are my two questions for Adriana. And then we would like very much to open the discussion. I think that we can also use Italian, if you don't mind. And maybe somebody have something to ask in Italian, and so please feel free.
Come si dice crescere in inglese?
To grow.
Yeah, Michele, scholar on Aristotle says that when he says that physis is fueling his generation, it is generation in the sense of being born and to grow. Like it is impossible to separate the concept of birth, of being born, by the concept of when you are born, immediately you begin to live and begin to grow. So it is interesting. What is interesting in Euripides is that all the tragedy, a part of the terrible story on simile, is not on birth, it's only in nourishment and growing. That's interesting.
Trying to think, there is this, it's in the back of my mind, but there is a word in English that refers to the bringing up, to the upbringing. So this idea of taking care of somebody in the sense of from birth to the growing up. There is a specific word that doesn't come now to my mind, but which is very material to some extent, or has a but it will come. No. It's a sort of una parola un po' desueta, non so, mi verrà in mente. Bisogna parlare in inglese. No, okay. Well, I had another question.
No, I was remembering Greek. Fuim and gignomai. No, gignomai is a question of generations. It's very interesting.
Ora, era un riferimento all'espressione che tu usi, to be beside oneself, well, this dimension of ecstasy, of going out, which you refer to through the example of breastfeeding again, or nourishing, in the sense that the female body nourishes and so goes outside itself, so being beyond oneself, which is also the expression that Judith Butler uses when she says to be beside oneself with rage, or to be beside oneself with grief. So grief and rage are also two moments of ecstatic, not in the positive sense, but of going outside oneself. And I remember that when I was translating Butler, I had a problem with this beside oneself, because if I would translate it literally, would be a fianco, beside. Invece è fuori, because in English say I'm beside myself for rage or for anger, or it's just a comment.
Sarebbe oltre.
Sì. Sì, è vero, quando dici besides, inoltre.
Ma infatti...
sì, che Michele ti ha detto del cannibalismo.
Cannibalism, you're absolutely right. It is part of political imagery, no? And I think that whenever a thinker claims that the necessity of violence in order to think the political, and what is the very root of violence? The very root of violence is cannibalism, homophagy. And we have in the mythical tradition, the Greek mythical tradition, a lot of homophagy. To kill your father, your son, to boil it and to eat. So we are in the phase of the cooked, not in before the raw. No, in the case of the cook, you boil the body, the human body, and you eat it. And it is the body of your son or the body of your father. It is also Zeus makes a lot of these crimes. And this constitutive of the political imaginary. But of course, in the tradition, there is this choice of marginalizing this imagery of cannibalism. No. So you say wolf instead of man eating and killing each other like wolf. But I agree with you, it is not a metaphor. It is just a gentle way of presenting human nature.
Lucia.
Thank you for the talk and for all the questions that helped us, I think, to enlarge the discourse and finding references to other aspects that are some way involved in this theoretical approach. I am wondering if we cannot consider that we are facing at present a form of return of the body, and we are facing a return of the material body or of corporeality exactly in a time when there is a main presence of the virtual component, of a disembodied partially component in the relationships. So I am wondering if we can talk of a return of the body and of a return of material life, also in the philosophical discourse today, because there is something that is pushing in the direction of something that is more disembodied than in the past and much more virtual, with all the consequences that this virtual condition or digital condition can bring for us. Thank you.
Yeah, the question is very difficult to have a simple answer to such a profound question. What I want to say is that in a way, if I look at the feminist tradition, that there always be the centrality of the body, and also today, the centrality of the body, e quindi, and then also the to interpret the political. You think of surrogacy, for example. To give an interpretation of the political and of reality by anchoring yourself to the centrality of the body, and the body is always a singular body, and generating power of the body is not of women in general, but it is always you that were born from a mother, and the mother is your singular mother. I mean, this is very important from a feminist point of view. I wrote with Olivia Guaraldo a book in Italian. The Italian title is Donne si nasce, qualche volta lo si diventa. The publisher is Mondadori, and we focus on this one. On the other hand, it is important to underline that the centrality of the body today in the last decades is also the centrality of the individual body, and this arrogance of constructing the body, of not being, come si dice, not having gratitude for the fact you are born, and you are born like you are, with your body, your face, your sex, but to manipulate your body, or in order to be forever young, you know, the aesthetic surgery, or in order to change your sexual identity and to work on your body in order to acquire your self-perceived sexual identity. So there is an individual manipulation and work on the body that in my opinion is a bit upsetting, It is anyway completely different to the feminist approach to the issue of the body, because the feminist approach is to make valorize, si dice, no, valorize è inventato, to empower this the characteristic, the natural characteristic of the female body as generative body, but also Olivia and I, we are Arendtian, we are scholar of Hannah Arendt, to have a gratitude for what is given and not fabricated, not made, but what is given. And to have gratitude for your body, your life, for your biological existence, which is part of the multitude of the form of life, and which is the miracle of the given. Instead of the desire and the will to change and to fabricate something different of what is given.
We could summarize it instead of the performative.
Yeah, the performative. But in my opinion, I like very much the word performative that we don't have in Italian. But in the performative, as it is used by the current discussion, there is a bit of art, a bit of beauty, a bit, the beauty of the execution. And I was insisting on this anthropocentric attitude for fabrication. Non so se tu lo sei d'accordo.
Yes, but also I think that your reflection on, as I was saying at the beginning, as Michela said, your style, your methodology, let's call it again this way, is a way to work with concepts in their materiality without come si dice, accondiscendere, the word doesn't come, to the...
Io penso che si dica condiscendere. Secondo me si accomplish.
Non so se accomplish, vabbè, comunque lo dico in italiano, lo dico, cioè la cosa interessante è che noi diciamo nel libro e che è la questione secondo me filosoficamente interessante e anche contestata, che non tutto è prodotto di discorso. Cioè, questa è la questione che ci interessa, no? E che quindi tu non puoi performare con il discorso e poi anche appunto fabbricare assecondando un performativo del discorso una materialità data che parla e che parla il linguaggio delle baccanti, insomma in questo senso è interessante come Euripide ci dica che ha paura di quella cosa.
Sì, assolutamente.
È chiaro, no? Che c'è molta paura per questa dimensione, questa potenza.
The Athenian audience was terrified by that. You see what is the Dionysian ritual in its very essence. It is better to have the Olympian religion for the polis. This was the message, of course.
If I may just add on the same note of what Olivia was saying, I was thinking that maybe also what distinguishes your approach in general and in this paper from, let's call it the new materialism, for example, maybe is a keyword that you use throughout the text that is uncanny. That means that there is this corporeal, that is bodily dimension, but it's not that it's just there and you can just disassemble, disentangle, everything is just can be somehow explained clearly. There is this component of uncanny that stays, and this can be only experienced. And so I was thinking that maybe that's a word that helps us also to distinguish between different way to go back to material, the materiality of the concept. That was just a comment.
And this reminds me that there is a famous phrase, sentence by Sophocles that says in Greek, "Deinon estio tiktein," which literally means deinon. Deinon is something terrifying that I translate as uncanny. That would be the German unheimlich, something like that. Deinon esti. Terrible, uncanny is tiktein. The to tiktein means to give birth, to generate. And Tokos is the song. The child is Tokos, tiktein.
Quando partorisci ti scrivono parto eutocico.
Ah, vedi, non sapevo. And Virginia Woolf, for her pleasure, translated this sentence, and instead of uncanny is to give birth, she translated there is a strange power in maternity. You know, the freedom of translating, and no, there is a strange power in maternity. Because this uncanny is also strange, is also uncommon, familiar, but also not familiar, unfamiliar. It is so familiar that we are born from a woman. Yeah. Every day, what is really familiar, really a sort of banality. No? On the other hand, there is something uncanny, strange in the power of giving birth. An experience, for example, that men cannot have. Or the pregnancy and the act of giving birth, this being doing one and this being possessed by a natural process who is in a way dispossessing you but making you be an accomplice in this regenerative process. All this is every day it happens. And on the other way, there is something strange and uncanny. So Virginia Woolf was right. A strange power, strange power. Io sono stanca. I'm 77.
Bene, possiamo concludere qui allora.
Thank you so much.
Grazie infinite. Concludo in italiano, penso che sia stata una bellissima serata e siamo stimolati da questi temi e da questi racconti che ci ha regalato Adriana Cavarero. Domani mattina la nostra conversazione con lei continua. Per chi vuole, cercheremo di sentire da lei la ricostruzione del suo itinerario intellettuale. Ci vediamo alle 10 in 227, sarà in italiano, e siamo davvero grati anche a Olivia, Natascia e Giacomo per i loro contributi e a voi che avete seguito questa serata. C'è, prego.
Speaking students here, other English speaking, I mean non-Italian. I was just wanted to let you know that in end of June, if you will still be in Italy, we are organizing in Verona at the Arendt Center for Political Studies, a 3-day conference on Hannah Arendt and council systems. It's an international conference and you're all welcome to attend. It's free, attending is free, and it's going to be a 3-day conference.
Grazie, buona serata.